Yep.
Okay. All right, we'll get started. Thanks everybody for joining. This should be a fun topic today. We're going to talk about the lack of SQL Server Agent in Azure SQL database today. My name is Bob Rubaki. I am a business intelligence consultant with Pragmatic Works, and I'm reachable online, so if anybody wants to ask questions or follow up or anything, you can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and a handful of blog posts. So the reason I wanted to do this topic today is because we're asked pretty frequently, either in other webinars or user groups, I'd like to use Azure SQL database, but there's an understanding that SQL Agent is not there. So how do I do the things that I do today in SQL Agent if it's not available? And just the sheer lack of availability of SQL Agent really puts a lot of fear into some people, and then they become really hesitant to move forward with adopting Azure SQL database, which is understandable. But with today's talk,
Bob, sorry to interrupt you here. I'm having some issues. A lot of people are having some issues with audio. Let me see if I can try to get that figured out here.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay.
Let me see. All right. Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. Yep. Can you hear me?
I mean, I can hear you just fine. I'm just wondering why we have a lot of people having issues with the sound here.
Okay.
Let's see. Okay. I will just have you keep on going, and I'll try to figure this out as we go. I can hear you just fine, but let me see if I can. We're recording this, so we can always, obviously everyone's going to get the recording tomorrow.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so I was saying that I wanted to present this topic today because we get asked a lot, with people understand that SQL Server Agent is not available in Azure SQL database, and so people start to get worried. Well, I use SQL Agent for a lot of things, so how am I going to manage this going forward? And a lot of people become really hesitant to adopt the Azure SQL database platform. So during today's talk, as I previewed a second ago, I'm hoping to kind of ease some of those fears. And as Aaron Rodgers from the Packers pretty famously said a couple of years ago, he spelled it out, but basically said, just relax. And so I'm hoping today that we can get everybody a little more comfortable with the notion that SQL Server Agent is not available in Azure SQL DB. So to do that, we'll begin with a brief overview of the Azure SQL database. We will review a lot of the use cases for how we're currently using SQL Server Agent today, and then we'll review some of those use cases and how they actually apply or how we would manage those in Azure SQL database. And then we'll finish today with an intro to Azure Automation and a couple of demos of that. This is not going to be a deep dive into Azure Automation, but it should be enough to give you an idea of what it can and can't do and a little bit about how to navigate the platform.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
So Azure SQL Database is Microsoft's database service in the cloud. It's also called or known as the platform as a service, meaning that the service is entirely managed, the entire platform is managed in the cloud. This is in contrast to what's known as infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, which is SQL Server deployed and managed on virtual machines. So we're talking today about the platform as a service and not the infrastructure as a service. So similar to what we call the on-prem SQL Server, Azure SQL databases are contained within what's called a logical server. So it's kind of similar to the look and feel of a SQL Server instance on-prem, but we just don't have all of the management features. It's really not a physical object out in the cloud. It's just more of a logical grouping of databases. When you're connecting to an Azure SQL database, the connection string is very similar to what we're familiar with the on-prem, and so anything we're doing with application connections or Management Studio, a lot of that looks and feels the same. You're connecting to a server just like you would an on-prem server. If you're getting familiar with Azure SQL Database, it's important to understand the notion of database service tiers. And the service tiers are listed across the top there. They go from basic all the way up to premium. And generally speaking, as we move from left to right, the performance it's stronger, and the databases support more concurrent users. It supports larger data sizes, and certainly they are more expensive as you move to the right as well. Now, for those on the call that have some experience with Azure SQL Database, you may notice that I am missing a tier on here. So this slide, I've used this before. I don't know, it's maybe a year old, give or take, but there is another service tier that would appear on the right, which is the P15, which is rated for 4,000 DTUs. And so DTU is another term that you want to be familiar with, and that is just as I've mentioned on the slide here, Microsoft calls this a blended measure of CPU memory I/O, and it's just a way to kind of quantify the power and capacity of the databases at each tier. Using the databases incurs cost by the hour, and it ranges anywhere from, give or take, about $5 a month for your most basic, which is really not really a enterprise-ready database, but regardless, if you want to try it, it costs as little as $5 a month. And then the top-end P15 right now is at about $16K per month, which is at the top end of that. If you're just getting started with this, generally speaking, even the standard tiers really don't provide good enough performance for any realistic business scenario. So most of the time we find that starting with the P1 for a business case or for business use is a good place to start. But if you're developing or you're learning, certainly the standard is acceptable there. So as we start to think about differences between the on-prem version of SQL Server and the cloud version of SQL Server, and this idea that SQL Server Agent is not available, there are a couple points that help me kind of understand the cloud database world that we're living in. And the first is to understand that Azure SQL Database was built from the ground up. It was not built just by porting over the on-prem database engine. So the end result is that today the features available in Azure SQL Database and on-prem are largely the same, but it is important to know that it was built from the ground up, So we cannot assume that just because it looks and feels similar, that everything that used to work in on-prem will be available and work the same way as it does in the cloud. And SQL Server Agent is a great example of that, right? It's something that's available certainly on-prem, but during the cloud development, it's just one of those things that's just not needed. It's just a different world. And then the other thing that helps me understand the world that we're living in today is that any new features, database features that Microsoft is currently developing will be deployed first to Azure SQL Database. And then, after they kind of gain some traction and get a little bit of feedback, then they are released to the on-prem version. And so an example of that I always think of is the row-level security functionality that's now available with SQL Server 2016. That functionality was first made available in Azure SQL Database, and then it was deployed to the on-prem. So again, just understanding, kind of how the cloud database service was built helps me understand why things don't work the same in the cloud as they do on-prem. So a lot of you are using SQL Server Agent, so probably at least a couple of these use cases would apply to you. So common uses for SQL Server Agent, certainly personally SSIS package execution is one that comes to the top of my mind quickly, and then followed by a handful of kind of management activities related to backups, right? So we use SQL Server Agent to run backups and to move them to storage. We also use it to manage replication, and if you're using log shipping, we can use SQL Server Agent to help manage log shipping. If you're using the change data capture tools, we understand that SQL Server Agent is required there. And then also reporting services subscriptions. So if you have a reporting services subscription running on a schedule, that schedule is managed with a SQL Server Agent job. So we're going to talk about how we can address some of these use cases in an Azure SQL database world, understanding that SQL Server Agent is not available. We'll start with SSIS package execution. So to be upfront, SSIS is not available in the platform as a service. It's just not a service that's available. So I know that doesn't sound very comforting, but we should know and be aware that we can use SSIS to connect to Azure SQL Database, so we can read from it and we can load data to it with SSIS. It's just a matter of where are we running SSIS from. So we can continue using SSIS in an on-prem or from an on-prem instance, or if you want, we can use the IaaS, which is the SQL Server running within a VM. And then the SQL Server instance in that VM could be running SSIS and pulling from and writing to those Azure databases. But it's also a good time to start, perhaps considering other technologies, so such as Azure Data Factory. So Azure Data Factory has some of the similar constructs as SQL Server. It has a framework for extracting and loading data, building workflows, which we can certainly understand from SSIS. But the transformations would require some custom code. So I'm not suggesting that Azure Data Factory is a complete replacement, but if we're moving up to the cloud and we understand that things operate a little bit differently, it may be appropriate to consider something like Azure Data Factory. Another very common use of SQL Server Agent is managing backups, right? So maybe we have a SQL Server Agent job that takes a backup of our database nightly or weekly, and that's a really common use. It is very important to understand that in Azure SQL Database, backups are managed entirely by the service. So that's something that's included in the price of it, and we have very little control over how it works or how it happens. which is kind of nice. So I mean, I think it's just one less thing that we have to worry about. Regardless of your service tier, Azure will automatically create full backups of your database on a weekly basis, and then it will do incremental backups and then transaction log backups. The frequency of the incremental backups and the transaction log backups depends a little bit on your service tier. So the higher your service tier, the more frequently in general those will execute. The frequency and the exact timing of how that all runs is managed entirely by Azure, and it depends on many different factors, but ultimately we really don't have any visibility into that. Depending upon your service tier, all of these backups will be available for anywhere from 7 to 35 days. I had to do a double check on that standard. The current documentation does say that it's available for 35. I think that has increased over time. It used to not be 35. And the idea with taking the full incremental and transaction log backups is that we have the capability to do point-in-time restores down to a really specific point in time back through that retention period. And again, this is all managed by the service, and we don't have really any control or visibility into this. So of course, lots of people need to keep backups for longer than 35 days for a variety of reasons. It could be for compliance, or it could be for any number of reasons. But Microsoft has introduced something called long-term backup retention, and this is something that can be configured. That's a separate service, but you now have the capability to keep backups going back as far as 10 years. So this is a relatively new service. I believe it's actually still in preview as I'm speaking today. And I put a little note there in the bottom. There are some custom solutions out there, people that have written some scripts, which we'll talk about shortly, to kind of manage the storage of the backups on your own. So you do have access to the backups. It's just that the process of creating the backup and then anything having to do with restoring is all managed within the service. But if you need to create a backup for, maybe you just want to take a copy of a database from one server, for example, and deploy it to another for maybe something beyond that 35-day window, you can certainly manage that yourself through some custom scripting. So I labeled this slide high availability. This covers everything in today's world of high availability groups and the old database mirroring and replication and log shipping. And I've lumped all of those things together because ultimately all of those, the high availability business continuity solutions are all managed entirely by the platform. So as far as SQL Server Agent goes, we do use SQL Server Agent today to manage replication, and we can also use it to manage log shipping. So we schedule a job to ship logs. And so the absence of SQL Server Agent in this particular case, again, similar to the backups, is really a non-issue because all of this is managed by the service. I've got a little bit more information on that shortly. As far as replication goes, like I said, Azure SQL Database does, well, I'll get to that in a second, but we can use Azure SQL Database as a subscriber from an on-prem database, but we cannot use Azure SQL Database as a publisher. We cannot manage the process of keeping redundant copies of an Azure SQL database. But if you have an on-prem database that you want to replicate, you can absolutely use Azure SQL Database as a subscriber to on-prem replication. But if we're using SQL Server Agent to manage that replication, that would all be done on that on-prem instance. So as far as the high availability and the old mirroring, and it's important to understand that when you provision an Azure SQL database, it automatically creates 3 replicas of your database in the Azure Data Center. So you have 1 primary and 2 secondary replicas, and those, when you write transactions to the primary, they ultimately get replicated over to the 2 secondaries. And under the covers, the difference between the 2, there are some differences, but we're not concerned with that at this point. But just understand that the platform manages or ensures that you have at least 3 replicas, all with the same data. And so now if any one of those 3 would go down for any reason, then one of the other 2 will become the primary, and that is all managed by Azure. So by default, you get the 3 replicas are in the data center that you choose when you create the database, but we can optionally set up geo-replication. So that would mean that if you've got a database in the central region, but you would feel more comfortable having it replicated to an additional Azure data center, maybe in the south, you can set that up optionally. There are 2 types of geo-replication available. There's standard and active, and really the difference between those 2 is that on the active, you can read the replicas, whereas on the standard, those are not readable. They're there for disaster recovery, really. SQL Server Agent is required to use the change data capture features, so if you're using that, you're probably familiar with that. Long story short, change data capture is not available in Azure SQL Database. So this is another one of these scenarios where if you're using SQL Server Agent for change data capture, that is no longer a concern moving to Azure SQL Database. Change data capture is a pretty neat feature. Part of the way that it works, though, is it, well, first of all, it uses SQL Server Agent to read the transaction logs, and the transaction log architecture is different in the Azure SQL database than it is in the on-prem version, so there are just a lot of architectural differences that kind of made change data capture difficult to implement in the cloud. If you are using change data capture, though, and you want to move to the cloud, there are some alternatives, and we've done some talks recently on temporal tables, for example. That's one possible alternative, but it's important to note, though, that if you are using it and you want to deploy, or I'm sorry, you want to migrate to Azure SQL database, that there are some alternatives to using change data capture. And then the last example I have here are report subscriptions. So if you are using scheduled report subscriptions from reporting services, those are executed by SQL Server Agent jobs. So there is no reporting services service in Azure yet. Similar to SSIS, though, we can run SSRS from a VM, which is the infrastructure as a service. And it's also important to know that reporting services can absolutely read data from Azure SQL Database as a source. So if you've got a data warehouse, for example, that's in Azure SQL Database, reporting services can read from that. It's just that that report service is not managed as part of the platform as a service. So we just went through a whole list of use cases or common use cases for how we're using SQL Server Agent today. And I hope at this point some of the fear and anxiety is eased a little bit, that there are certain situations that either don't apply when we're using Azure SQL Database, or situations where we have workarounds to kind of cover the lack of SQL Server Agent. Of course, there are other use cases for SQL Server Agent, so I'm not saying we're totally in the clear here, but I do want to, I hope that at this point some of our fears are eased. So What do we do about those other use cases? We're going to talk about how Azure Automation may help with that. And at this point, we're kind of turning the page away from on-prem SQL now to the cloud platform as a service. So Azure Automation really deals with managing any of your Azure resources. And so that's all of your VMs and VPNs and storage and your SQL Server servers and databases. So as far as what Azure Automation can do for SQL database, it can do quite a lot. The first one I've listed here is running SQL scripts. So that is something that we do a little bit of, right, in SQL Server Agent is, maybe we're running something to update database statistics or whatever the case may be. So we can use Azure Automation to run those SQL scripts. But then the next couple points I have here are really use cases that only apply to Azure. So the service tier, we talked about that earlier. When you create an Azure SQL database, you have to pick a service tier. But over time, your needs change. So your database may be getting larger and it may be getting more use and you need to scale that up. Or maybe you want to scale it up and down during heavy use time. So we can use Azure Automation to perform that scale up, scale down. A similar technology, we haven't really talked about this yet today, but on the surface it looks and feels similar to Azure SQL Database, and that's the Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And for the purpose of today, it's just important to understand that the Azure SQL Data Warehouse service can be turned on and off. So if you're not using it for overnight or on the weekends or whatever, that service can be turned off and you won't incur any charges for running the service. There is charge for the storage, but we can use Azure Automation to schedule the pausing and restarting of the Azure SQL Data Warehouse. We can also deploy logical SQL servers. We can set up firewall rules. We can deploy databases. So if we have scripts ready to do that, Azure Automation can absolutely do that for us. And these are just a few use cases. There are certainly many others. So outside of Azure SQL Database, just for your, I guess, frame of reference, I'm going to skip to the bottom quote there, and this is something that I just pulled from Microsoft's documentation. Azure Automation can do anything that you can do in PowerShell. So Azure Automation is really built on PowerShell. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But it's common to use Azure Automation for managing VMs. So similar to the use case we talked about earlier, we can turn them on and off if we're not using them during certain times. If we're using blob storage, we can manage our blob storage, so we can perhaps remove blobs that are older than a certain date, or we can upload new ones from our local file system. We can automate a lot of processes that are dealing with loading or removing, just managing your blob storage. The diagnostic information, so we can run automation scripts that will tell us about resource usage, or how much space we're using, or which databases are at what service tier. There's just a lot we can do with it. And to get started in this, it can be a little bit overwhelming. We're going to talk about just a couple cases of how we can use this for the database. But yep, so we'll get to that in a second. So a concept that's very important to understand as we get into Azure Automation is the notion of a runbook. So a runbook is what I call the kind of the unit of work in Azure Automation. So if you want to automate something with Azure Automation, you do that with a runbook. And for the purpose of today's talk, it's I'd say fair to to compare a runbook to a SQL Server Agent job, right? Certainly they're not the same, but it's kind of the same idea where it's a unit of work that can be scheduled to run when we need it to. The second point there is interesting. We'll talk about this in a demo, but you have two primary options for creating runbooks, and one is just straight PowerShell script. So anything like we talked about earlier that you can do in PowerShell, you can do in automation, and so anything you can script, that script can be ported over to a runbook. But Azure Automation also offers a graphical design tool, which is kind of neat, and we'll talk about that in a second. But if you're maybe new to PowerShell, or I'll walk through an example. It'll make a lot more sense in just a second. But the graphical design is a really neat feature of Azure Automation. I'm risking a little bit of confusion here, but Azure Automation does have the notion of a job. And a job is simply an execution of a runbook. So every time a runbook executes, it creates a job. And I'll show you that in a second, but it wouldn't be fair to skip over that word job here. It's important to know we have those, but those are different than SQL Server Agent jobs. So remember, SQL Server Agent jobs, now we're talking about runbooks. So this is an example of a graphical runbook. So what we see on the right is an actual runbook that comes when we create this service, which we'll do in a second. It comes with a handful of tutorial runbooks, and this is one of them there. So each of those boxes is a different PowerShell commandlet that has configuration inside it, and then you can connect them and create those workflows visually. I say it looks a little bit like SSIS. I'm not saying that it is, but the workflow would feel kind of similar, and it just gives you that visual capability to say, okay, when this one runs, then this goes next, etc. Under the covers, these graphical runbooks are absolutely PowerShell, but it is really important to understand that, first of all, we cannot see the actual PowerShell script that's generated. We can see the code that's behind each of the components there. We'll walk through that in a second. But you cannot look at the PowerShell script. And that's important to know because while they're a great tool and they're good for learning, we cannot just copy the script that was created and then put it into a script runbook and then add to it or anything. So they're pretty neat, but just understand that what you get is what you get here. We can't see the details of the code behind it. So I mentioned this earlier, but in Azure Automation, we do have the notion of jobs. And so we can see that on the left side there inside my automation account, there is a category for jobs. And then on the right is just a list of jobs that executed. And so those again are just instances of runbook execution. If you notice on this screenshot, there's no button or option to create a job. So I put this here just to kind of clarify that terminology and show a little bit about how that works. We can schedule our runbooks. So this is kind of similar to SQL Server Agent, and we'll see that a little bit in a demo shortly, but we have similar scheduling capabilities as far as frequency. If I run it on the second Tuesday of the month at 8 o'clock or whatever, it gives us a lot of that similar flexibility that we have in SQL Server Agent. So how do we get started with Azure Automation? It's pretty simple, actually. So if you have an Azure subscription, I guess that's the first thing, got to have an Azure subscription. And once you have that subscription, you just create what's called an Azure Automation account. We'll walk through how to do that in a second. But it is pretty simple. I showed just a brief or a short screenshot there. That's really all that it looks like. You give the account a name, you tell it what subscription, assign a resource group, and a couple other options we'll show in a second. But it's very, very simple to get started creating or working with Azure Automation. When you create the Azure Automation account, it does come with, I believe, 4 tutorial scripts, and I found these to be pretty handy. We'll walk through what those look like in a second. But if you're getting started with this, I would encourage you to look at those and review them and kind of see some of the patterns that they use for connecting to Azure and things like that. And also, if you're new to PowerShell, or new to PowerShell, there's something called the Runbook Gallery. And so there are a number of runbooks that have been created, many of them by Microsoft, but many of them by people in the community. So people have written a lot of runbooks already that will do some of the tasks that that we've mentioned earlier. So some of the scale up, scale down of the database, or moving files in and out of blob storage, or turning VMs on and off. There are a lot of those scripts available out there kind of as, I mean, they work, but then you can download them and extend them as you want. So I encourage you, if you're getting started, to take a look at the Runbook Gallery, which we will do here in just a second. That's it for my slides. So I am going to hop over. We're going to go over to the Azure Portal. So if you have an Azure subscription and you want to play with Azure Automation, this is where we would start. We can script all this, but certainly I prefer for today to use the portal. I want to show you how to create an Azure Automation account. So here I'm just going to come into the Add New, and I'm just going to search for Automation. Whoops, and if I could spell it correctly, that would help. And there is a service here called Automation. It gives us some background on the service and what it is and how it works. That's fine. I'll hit Create. And I'll give this a name. It's going to ask you for a subscription and assign it to a resource group. So I will assign this to an existing resource group that I have. It's going to ask you for a location. So these are the different data centers where the Azure Automation service is available. I'll leave this in the South Central for now, US. This Run As account, I don't want to go into great detail here. I think generally speaking, it's good to just leave this as yes. And it has to do with the type of resources that we're running Azure Automation against. And that's it. I'm not going to do this because I have one set up already, but if you hit Create, this will set up your automation account. That's all there is to it to get started. Now, right, discarded, that's fine. Now I have an automation account already set up. And so when you set it up, this is what you'll see here. I want to skip down to the runbooks. I want to show how we can get started with runbooks. And I mentioned that when we create our account, it creates a handful of tutorials. And I've got some other scripts in here, but it will give you these 4 tutorial scripts. And I encourage you to explore those. They're pretty handy. So you notice a couple different icons here. This little hierarchy here means that it's a graphical script, and this one here just means that it's PowerShell, the little PowerShell logo there. Okay. So I'm going to go into one of these here. I'm going to take a look at the one that's called the graphical one for Azure Automation Tutorial, and we'll just talk a little bit about how to navigate the interface here. When I'm viewing the Azure Automation Tutorial, what I want to do right now is view it. I want to see what this thing looks like. And so this is the one that I used in the slides, but we can see the different steps here. And we can also, so this is the viewing. What I wanted to do instead was edit, which we'll see in a second is a little bit, offers some more information. But if I edit this runbook, now I can see what all the different pieces of code are doing. So this README here would include some information here that the developer has included. So this is just some handy notes for us on this one, which is pretty nice. So I use this a lot as you're learning about how to manage runbooks. The other thing that's really neat in here on the Azure Automation is this test pane. So on all of my runbooks, so I ran this one earlier, I have this test pane, and if my runbook is set up with parameters or variables, it will prompt me to enter values for those here, but in this particular example that is deployed when we create it, there are no parameters. And so I can hit start and it'll execute this runbook. What this one is doing is just a simple process of going out into my subscription and just creating a list of all of the resources that are in my subscription. So it's not, the output is not all that interesting, I suppose, but it is a pretty good example of how to get started with runbooks. So that's an example of a graphical. Let's take a look at one that was generated from a script, or not generated, but it was provided, and it is the script. So this is the Azure Automation tutorial script, and this does the very similar thing to what the graphical one did, except now this one is all in PowerShell. And so if I edit now, what I have here is just PowerShell script. So where I was saying that the graphical and the tutorials are a good way to learn, this is what I was talking about. These two runbooks that come automatically when you create that account, you can compare, okay, this is how it looks in the graphical, and this is the code that was really running behind the scenes. Okay, so I want to talk then about the gallery. I said the Runbook Gallery. So if I'm in my list of runbooks, I can add a runbook, which would be I can write PowerShell script or I can import a PowerShell script. But what I want to do right now is just browse the gallery, and this is that listing of scripts or runbooks, excuse me, that have already been created for us to use. Many of them work right out of the box, but certainly they work great as starting points if you want to take them further. And I'm going to search for one in here called Hello World, right? So kind of the old getting started with programming, everybody's got a Hello World, so this one is no exception. So to use this or import this, I'm just going to click the link here. It's going to tell me a little bit about what it does, and I'm going to hit this import button here. And this is fine. I'm going to keep the default name here. I cannot choose the runbook type because that's already been determined for me. I'll hit OK here, and it's going to import this in. So a couple things I want to point out here on this is I'm in the context now of this Hello World runbook, which I could get to now from my list of runbooks. I should have, yes, my list of runbooks. I have an additional entry now for Hello World. Okay. So quickly, one thing I want to point out is that a lot of my options up here to start this runbook or to view it, schedule it, are all grayed out. They're not available. And I want to show you how we can enable those. This is true when every time I have a new runbook that comes in. I want to just test this Hello World. So to use that test pane, I come into Edit here. And I'm just going to run the test pane. And I'm just going to enter a text value here and run this script and see what it does. Okay. So this is now when I run this test, it's queuing up a job in Azure. So the response time here is going to be slower than we're used to just to start a job in SQL Server Agent. But we'll see here quickly that it will just output the simple, well, I won't spoil it. It'll come here in a second. After this one is done, we're going to talk about how to do the scheduling, and then I'm going to show just a very quick example of a runbook that will scale an Azure SQL database, or change that performance tier, excuse me. So it says it's running. So this is a good reminder for me. The pricing on Azure Automation really is based on the execution time duration of your automation processes. So if you're running a lot of jobs and they all take a long time, that's going to increase the cost incurred to use this. Now the free tier to get started here, you get up to 500 minutes of execution for free. So to get started, that's plenty to play around with. I mean that. So there's the output. My hello, the classic hello world. I said hello webinar. Okay. So this is just a very quick example of how I referenced a pre-built runbook from the gallery. I imported it and I tested it. And if you recall, when I imported it, the scheduling options were not available. Yeah, that's fine. Come on. Well, let me try this again while that's thinking. See if it came back. Well, that is unfortunate. So what I'm going to try to do here real quick is get into my Azure account and do this quickly. All right, so I'm going back into my automation account, and I want to look at that runbook, the Hello World, and understand why the scheduling was not enabled. And so what we have to do to make the scheduling enabled is in this edit, I have just simply imported this. What I need to do is to publish this, and publish this is making this then available to me in my Azure Automation account. At this point in the process, I've just downloaded it, I'm viewing it, I'm playing with it. But once I publish it, yep, that's okay. I want to publish it. And now when I publish it, I have the scheduling capabilities available. So that's a tip for you there. So you've got to publish them before you have the scheduling. But here's where I'd set up the schedule. Link a schedule. I can create a new one here. And this is where I've got many of those other recurrence options, you know, daily, weekly, hourly, et cetera, et cetera. So quickly, I want to show one more sample runbook here. Whoops, not jobs. I want to go to my runbooks and my runbooks. So I have this runbook here. I downloaded this one from the gallery, and you can see I haven't even published it yet because my schedule is not available. But this one will scale up or down a Azure SQL database. And so before we take questions here, I'm just going to execute this in my edit. I'm just going to do this to the test pane to show a little bit about how the parameters work. So this particular runbook is asking me for a resource group name. Which I've got there. My server name is here. My database name is this. This is asking me what database edition I want to change to. So I know that my database is in basic right now. I'm going to change this to standard. And this is just that pricing tier. I don't need to provide a subscription ID. All of this information on the pricing tiers is available online, but that corresponds to that chart I showed earlier. And then I'll go ahead and start this. So this takes a couple minutes to run. That was all of the material I had for today. And so I think at this time I'm ready to take some questions.
Awesome. All right. Do you want me to just read you the questions?
That would be fine, yeah, because I cannot see them. So yeah.
Okay. Yep. All right. So John has a question for you. He said, is there a way to calculate a local VM's DTUs for comparing against Cloud Azure SQL database?
Of VM's DTUs, if I understand the question, I think you're trying to ask about SQL Server deployed to a VM compared, and then trying to find the corresponding service tier of Azure SQL database. So if that's the question, there are some tools online that estimate that. Somebody at Microsoft put together I think it's called a DTU estimator, and so you can enter in criteria such as, okay, I'm running, at this CPU level, I'm doing this much I/O, and I've got this many users, and it will create an estimated DTU requirement for you. I hope that answers that question.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Next question is from Matt. He says, it's probably not possible to convert from PowerShell to graphics automatically. Can graphical programs be converted to PowerShell automatically?
So if we're talking about the runbooks, the graphical runbooks cannot be converted to PowerShell. So I hope that answers that question. The question said graphical programs. So if we're talking again about runbooks, the answer is no. If you create a graphical runbook, that will remain graphical, and you cannot port that over to be script. And the reverse is true as well. If you have a PowerShell script that you want to see, so I think I have a typo in my resource group. I'll try that in a second. If you have a PowerShell workbook, you cannot then convert that to a graphical either.
Okay, next question I have is from Ramesh. He asks, is it possible to call Azure SQL Data Warehouse stored procedure from Azure Automation?
Yes, it is. So there you can absolutely run SQL scripts or SQL commands. You would just have to connect to Azure, connect to the server, and I would encourage Ramesh to look out at the Runbook Gallery. There are some examples out there of how to run SQL scripts against your database. And I know he mentioned specifically the warehouse, but the paradigm there is very similar between the warehouse and the Azure SQL database.
Okay, and Ramesh also followed up with one other question. He also needed to know whether it's possible to process SSAS tabular cube in Azure VM from automation script.
I believe that it is possible, because I was just looking at. I'm going to have a tough time with this one. I'm going to have to follow up on that one. I do believe that it's possible. I don't know offhand how to do that though.
Okay, and I'll be emailing you all these questions so you can address these also, because we may not be able to get to all of these by noon, which is in 1 minute from now. So I'm going to give you one last question from Tim.
Okay.
He said, can I send email notifications based upon the results of an individual job?
The short answer is yes, but the long answer is that is not something. That's a really good question, actually. This is not something that's baked into Azure Automation the way that it is in SQL Server Agent. So in SQL Server Agent, we have some pretty great controls there to say, okay, if it succeeds, do this, and if it fails, do that, send an email, etc. So you can do it, but it is not native built in like it is in SQL Server Agent. So I hope that answers that question.
All right, well, thank you, Bob. It is noon, so we're going to wrap up this webinar today. I want to thank all of you for joining our webinar. We apologize for the technical difficulties we had earlier in the session, and I want to remind you all that we will be sending a full recording of the webinar via email tomorrow for your reference. And I know we weren't able to address all the questions. I will be forwarding all those questions to Bob so that he can hopefully get back to you If anyone else has any other questions for Bob to answer regarding today's webinar, please email me at etotten@pragmaticworks.com, and let me spell that out for you. It's ETOTTEN@pragmaticworks.com. Thanks again for joining us.